Good morning, kids and families. Welcome to another grand adventure here in the Sandbox at City View Church. My name is Pastor David, and I am so grateful that you guys have tuned in for today's Sandbox lesson. You know what I've been thinking about recently? I've been thinking about family. I love my family so much. My mom and my dad. I even love my brothers, even though we fight sometimes. Family is, as I like to say, one of God's greatest blessings on this whole world. But did you know that we are all part of God's family? That's right. He is our Father and we are His children. You and me, we are brothers and sisters in God. Today's Bible story centers around a woman named Ruth. And her story is incredible. It is a beautiful expression of God's love and the openness of God's family.
God's story, Ruth. So part of God's story is about a woman named Ruth, and it begins like this. Ruth lived in a place called Moab and was married to a guy who was part of God's special family, the Israelites. A few years later, though, Ruth's husband died. Instead of returning to her family, which would have been expected, she stayed with Naomi, her husband's mom. Naomi tried to get Ruth to go back to her family in Moab, but Ruth wouldn't leave Naomi, no matter what. In fact, she wanted to go back to Israel with her. Ruth said, "Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So they both returned to Naomi's home in Bethlehem. Back then, though, it was hard for women to find work. Usually, they had to be taken care of by their husband or a dad. It's really hard to imagine that now, but Naomi and Ruth might not have even known how they'd survive. At first, to get food, Ruth went to the fields of a man named Boaz and followed his harvesters around. If they dropped anything, even just a piece of grain, she picked it up. This was called gleaning. Ruth worked from morning to night and barely even took a break. Boaz noticed. He told his workers to leave behind some extra grain for her to gather. When Naomi heard about this, she was overjoyed, because Boaz was Naomi's relative and what's called a family redeemer. That meant that it was his responsibility to take care of his family. If anybody was going to rescue Ruth and Naomi, it was Boaz. Kids, we have a redeemer too. It's Jesus. He's the one who saves us. When Boaz asked who Ruth was, she said, "I am your servant. You are my family redeemer." Now Boaz understood. Ruth wanted Boaz to marry her so that she and Naomi would both be taken care of. Boaz agreed. This was a huge deal. Ruth wasn't an Israelite, but she wanted to follow God anyway. By marrying Boaz, she got to officially be part of God's family. In fact, Ruth's great-grandson was King David, and many, many years later, Jesus, the rescuer, was born into the same family line. Now, because of Jesus, we get to be a part of God's family too. So, in case you missed it, here's the quick version. Ruth was from Moab. Her husband died. Ruth was left with his mom, Naomi. Naomi told her to go home. Ruth said no. She went to Israel with Naomi. They needed someone to take care of them. Ruth gleaned in a field. Boaz noticed. He left extra grain for Ruth. She wanted to marry Boaz. He agreed. Ruth became part of God's special family, and we can too. And that's a part of God's story.
At the beginning of her story, Ruth was outside of the family of God. But God still saw her, and he still loved her. God's arms were wide open, ready to receive her and anybody else who would love God. Her husband had just died, and she was living with his mother. Her heart was full of love for family, and God saw that too. God sees everything, of course. One day, her mother told her, "Go and work in the field," because they needed food to survive. So she went, found a field, and began working. And as she was working hard and diligently to get enough food that she could provide for herself and for her mother. And then, rather quickly, the owner of the field himself, a man named Boaz, came by. And he saw her beauty, and he also saw her love. And needless to say, he was interested. And Ruth, the man who was looking at Ruth, Mr. Boaz, he was a part of God's open family. And God was planning to bring Ruth into his family through Boaz. So he told all of his workers to treat her extra special so she could be taken care of and have enough food for her mom and for herself. Eventually, the two of them fell in love, and they were married. Ruth was welcomed into a new family. Not only Boaz's family, but the family of God. She came to know and to love God himself, and she was welcomed into God's open family. Kids, God's arms are wide open, and so is his family. It didn't matter who Ruth was or what she had done. God saw her, and he wanted her to be part of his family. And the same is true for us, for you and for me and for everybody. God's arms are wide open for everybody. Sometimes we make mistakes. We do bad things, and we turn our backs on God. But don't be afraid. God's arms are still wide open, ready for us to return to him at any moment. And sometimes we might see people who are outside the family of God, who look scary or who do bad things. But God's family is open to everyone, no matter what, because God loves people no matter what. This is why I love the story of Ruth so much, because we can see someone outside the family of God being welcomed in because of God's love for people. God's open family has its arms open wide for everybody. So everyone, take your arms, close them up, put your hands together, do a little wiggly worm. Show me the wiggly worms. All right, close your hands. And let's pray out today's Bible, Sandbox, story, video, lesson. Dear God, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your love. And thank you for the openness of your family. You love everybody no matter what. And for this reason, your family is open to everybody no matter what. The story of Ruth is so beautiful because we can see you in the story. Thank you for your love. Thank you for the Bible. Thank you for everyone watching today's video. And thank you for Jesus Christ. And all God's Sandbox children said, Amen.